and this meeting is now being recorded. And we also we'll tell you a little bit about the University of Michigan Press ebook collection, which is through our own Fulcrum platform. This book will be free to read until August 31st. We hope that you'll participate in our polling and in the chats, and we will be providing a recording after. To start with, we'd like to get to know you a little bit. I'm going to launch a poll. What is your primary role? Why are you here? Are you one of our authors? Are you an author for another press? Are you just a reader interested in the topic? Let us know, and I'll allow a little bit of time for that. A lot of professors and instructors, some librarians. Researchers, readers. All right, excellent. We have most, about 81% responding, so I'm gonna share the results. So a lot of you are professors and instructors or researchers, which is great. That will help help our speaker in how to frame what he's going to be talking about. Just a bit about University of Michigan Press. We were founded in 1930 and have been part of the University of Michigan Library since 2009. We publish about 100 new books each year and have published around more than 5,000 titles to date. We consider our key strengths political science, performing arts, classics and archaeology, American studies, African studies, and Asian studies. We also have an English language teaching division and a small trade list mainly about the United States Great Lakes region. And we have a commitment to digital scholarship, including open access, and our Fulcrum platform is a big part of that. The University of Michigan Press ebook collection is, as I mentioned before, all of the books featured in the Author Talk Live series are included in the ebook collection and will be free to read until August 31st. EBC is part of Fulcrum, an open source community developed platform supporting new forms of humanities scholarships. And also provides the opportunity for scholars and authors to provide digital enhancements such as 3D models and so forth. You can ask your library about attaining it for your institution. And so, without further ado, I'd like to present T.H.M. Gellar-Goad, Associate Professor of Classics and Zachary T. Smith Fellow at Wake Forest University, discussing Laughing Atoms, Laughing Matter. Be over to you.
All right, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for coming today. Thanks to Sean and Linnell and Teresa for putting this together. So my book is a study of Lucretius's De Rerum Natura. That's the last time I'll say it rolling my R's. De Rerum Natura, which is often translated as On the Nature of Things or On the Nature of the Universe. It's a Latin poem of about 7,400 lines that was scholars don't know anything about Lucretius, Titus Lucretius Carus, other than his name, and that he was probably from Rome itself. There's no reliable ancient information on his biography, but the poem itself seems to have been begun circulating around 55 BCE. So that puts him as a contemporary of Cicero and Julius Caesar and Catullus towards what scholars have traditionally called the end of the Republic before the beginning of the Roman Empire. This poem is a work of didactic poetry. Didactic poetry is a genre of poetry that explicitly claims or suggests or implies that it is going to teach, that is teaching poetry. There's didactic poetry in Greece as early as Hesiod, the first poet that survives after Homer, and after the time of Lucretius himself in Rome, Virgil's Georgics is probably the most famous ancient work of didactic poetry. And what they can be on a variety of different topics. Virgil's Georgics is on farming. There's poems, didactic poems on astronomy, on snake bites, on dog hunting with dogs. There can be on a variety of things. What they all have in common is, one, they claim to teach. Two, they almost all use one specific form of poetry, this meter called dactylic hexameter. And three, scholars more recently have been interrogating ways in which they might not actually be about teaching. They might instead be presenting a performance of teaching, or doing something more complex, or using the idea of teaching to address social or political or literary issues. So that's sort of what I'm doing with my book. One of the thing that this poem De Rerum Natura is claiming to teach, or presenting itself as teaching, is the philosophy of Epicurus. Epicurus was a Greek who lived during the Hellenistic periods. That's after the death of Alexander the Great. He was born slightly before that, but he's active afterwards. And he's the founder of the school of Epicureanism. You might be familiar with the word epicure or Epicurean from fancy food nowadays. That's the sort of reputation it has. But Epicureanism was a philosophy that was based principally on the idea that the best thing in life is pleasure. And pleasure is properly defined as an absence from pain and a freedom from anxiety. On that next bullet point, ataraxia, that Greek word that's highlighted, that means freedom from anxiety, and that's the highest good for Epicurus's philosophy. The thing that Epicurus taught were the sort of the biggest obstacles to freedom from anxiety were attachment to things like wealth or erotic infatuation or religion, and he diagnosed all of those as ultimately being caused by a fear of death and a fear of the gods and a fear of the afterlife. His answer to this was to draw on an earlier body of philosophy that taught that the world, the way the world as it exists, it consists of atoms, these indivisible particles that are interacting with each other in the void. And that's a school of philosophy called atomism. If it sounds really close to what you learned in science class, that's basically just a lucky guess. There's no scientific method that these philosophers are using. It's just one of a variety of guesses that happens to be closer to what we think is real than not, except of course atomism itself breaks down nowadays with quantum theory. So Lucretius's poem De Rerum Natura is presenting Epicurean philosophy to a Roman audience. My book is complicating the notion that has often been held to be true about this poem, which is that it is written by an Epicurean missionary trying to convert the reader to Epicurean philosophy. One of the ways that I challenge this orthodoxy, which is not a sort of 100% orthodoxy these days, but if you asked someone in the 50s or 60s, a classicist, to tell you what this poem was about, that's what they'd say. But nowadays, there still are a lot of people who think, yes, this is the goal of this is conversion. One of the ways I challenge this is by importing to the study of Lucretius something that's well established for other authors in Greek and Roman antiquity, this division between poet and persona. What I mean here is you have the poet, the author of the book, of the poem itself, and then you have the persona, the speaker or narrator or main character within the poem, the one who's doing the teaching when it's didactic poetry, who often shares a name with the author, may share biographical details with the poet, but we should not treat them the same as the poet. In studies of Ovid, another Roman poet, almost no one working on Ovid these days takes seriously the idea that the exaggerated, radical claims that the Ovid speaker makes about his erotic misadventures. No one takes those to be autobiographical accounts by Ovid. And so that critical lens, that distinction between the person writing, the historical figure, who we can't recover a lot of because they're dead and often there's not much reliable biographical data about them, and the rich figure that they present in the poetry that has the same name as them as a persona, that division I think is important and is one I'm trying to get Lucretian scholars to use more than they have been. I think we can go on to the next slide. So my book focuses on the way Lucretius's poem interacts with satire. And in order to study this, I have to explain what is satire. I divide satire into two main categories for the purposes of my study: genre and mode. When I'm talking about genre, I'm talking about a specific historical literary genre of Roman verse satire, or the Roman name for it is Satura, which is where we get the word satire from. It's a small body of poetry written in a specific, for the most part, written in a specific verse form that extends from before the time of Lucretius, from Ennius, who's viewed as kind of like the founding father of Roman literature, and Lucilius, who's portrayed by later Roman satirists as the founding father of Roman satire. They're operating before Lucretius. And then after Lucretius, the most famous satirists from ancient Rome, Horace and Juvenal, and another one who doesn't get the credit that I think he's due, Perseus, who's between them in time. Horace is writing under Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Perseus is writing under Nero, and Juvenal is writing later under Domitian and others. So they're figures of the empire. Ennius and Lucilius are figures of the Roman Republic, and Lucretius is writing in this sort of liminal period where the Republic is collapsing, but the empire hasn't yet taken shape. By the way, if you know the phrase "bread and circuses" or the phrase "who will watch the watchmen," those are some famous lines from the satires of Juvenal. You probably think "Who Will Watch the Watchmen" is about security, the security state or Big Brother or something. No, it's actually about you can't trust your wife not to have sex with people while you're out of the house, so you put a watch person on the door to keep dudes from coming in, but she'll start with him and have sex with him, so then he'll let other people in and have sex with her. And so who will watch the watchman? Context is pretty important in these kinds of things. So anyway, that's the Roman verse genre of satire, and that's one half of what my book studies, is how Lucretius's poem engages with this Roman genre. And I find lots of places, I do an exhaustive study, a lot of places where Lucretius's poem makes allusions or references to Ennius or Lucilius, borrows from this earlier work, imitates it, shows some sort of stylistic heritage to it. And then I look in the other direction and I look at ways Horace, Perseus, and Juvenal, the later Roman satirists, use Lucretius in their own satire. And what I find is that in a lot of the places that Horace, Perseus, and Juvenal are doing their kind of programmatic big picture statements about what satire is about or what their satire is about, they're not just alluding to Lucilius, their founding father figure, but they're also alluding to Lucretius. And so I think that this shows the way that they use Lucretius, not just as something to make fun of, but also as something to work with and engage in satiric moments with. I think that this shows that Lucretius, though he's not part of this genre of satire formally speaking, that his poem influences the trajectory of satire. It's kind of like a detour on off the main path of satire, and shapes the way that the later satirists write their satire. So that's the one big category of satire. The other big category of satire that I study is the mode of satire. And this is, rather than a genre, which is kind of like a delineated group of texts, mode is a set of tools and techniques that satirists use from the earliest texts that still survive from the earliest days of human writing, all the way to modern TV comedies or news satire, that kind of thing. There are a lot of sort of the obvious elements of this: parody, sarcasm, other kinds of humor, mockery, a personal voice, often humor that is self-undercutting or self-deprecating. But I want to talk briefly about some of the things about satire, how satire seems to work that might not be so obvious. And I'm willing to admit that there is collusion in satire. What I mean is that satire creates a divided audience. Satire is something that you can get or not get. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in this talk in detail. But the fact that you can get it or you cannot get it means that you have two, or maybe more, but you have at least two audiences: the get it crowd and the don't get it crowd, the in group and the out group, what some scholars like to call wolves who get it and sheep who don't get it. The collusion comes in because the satirist is speaking to the in-group and also making you, the reader, think you're part of the in-group, and getting them to laugh not only at the jokes and the humor in the satire, but also to laugh at the sheep, to laugh at the people who don't get it. So the mockery is not just in satire is not just what is being satirized, but is also the people who are engaging with satire but not getting it. The coercion on my bullet point comes in, though, because when you're reading something, you don't want to be an idiot, right? So if the satirist is communicating to you that there are two groups, the people who get it and the people who don't get it, you're going to feel this pressure to get it, to be part of the get it group. But when you do, you're aligning yourself up with the satirist, and you may or may not actually agree with what the satirist is trying to bring forward, or what you think the satirist is trying to bring forward. And so there's that coercive tension there, where you are being pushed to side with the satirist based off of how they've structured the audience rather than based on how persuasive they're being. So that's one of the sort of most complicated, fascinating, and exciting things about satire, and challenging things about satire, I think. So my book, Laughing Atoms, Laughing Matter, uses this model of satire, this this structure of the mode of satire as I've sort of formulated it here, to look at the poem of Lucretius and again do an exhaustive study and find that though this poem is supposed to be a philosophical conversion text, something teaching philosophy to you and persuading that this is the most logical approach to living the good life, that there is a lot of satire, not just in the fancy poetic purple passages, but also in the argumentation on the detailed level of atoms, or on how vision works, or on how our body produces semen, all of these different things that sort of come up as ways to make you less scared about your body and the gods and the afterlife and thunder and volcanoes and stuff. And so this use of satire throughout, I argue, should make us a little more skeptical of treating this as a lot of scholars do, especially philosophers. I'm a classicist rather than a philosopher, which means I'm interested in literary texts and the Roman civilization and culture, not in how I can use this for philosophical understanding of the nature of humanity or something like that. Philosophers really rely on this text as a major source for Epicurean philosophy. And I'm not so sure that we can take it as a fair, reliable reporter of what Epicureans believed in the time of Epicurus or in the time of Lucretius. So that's one thing. The other thing that another conclusion I reach with my study of the satiric mode here is that what Lucretius is doing with this poem is maybe not presenting Epicureanism, but presenting Epicurean satire, giving us three different ways that Epicureanism and satire interact. The first is the poem presents a figure who's named Lucretius and who writes about Epicurean philosophy, this persona that the poet is creating, who is an Epicurean using satire to advance his goals, who's maybe not being a fair teacher, who's representing all sides fairly, representing the critiques as well as the good reasons fairly, but instead is giving you kind of straw man arguments and so on and so forth. So that's number one. Number two is showing you a way to use satire to think and act like an Epicurean. So what I mean here is Epicureans are supposed to live a life free from anxiety. This often means that you need to have a sort of level of detachment from from society. The Epicureans seem to have generally recommended not getting involved in politics, for instance. And you also have to detach yourself from attachment to material goods, from your erotic infatuation with people, from certain ideas about how society should be, from received notions about the gods and religion, and from your fear of death, which is a hard thing to detach ourselves from. And also you have to detach yourself from worrying about history in a lot of these things. So all of that means that you're kind of taking a vantage point to look down on society from above, from what Lucretius calls the well-defended heights of philosophy in the opening of his second book of his poem. This, I argue, is kind of a model for how not only Epicurean philosophy works, but also for how satirists work. They take a position separate from society and above society, of the moral high ground, and they use that to observe and critique society in an attempt, whether a good faith attempt or a not good faith attempt, to make society better. All right, so that's the basic outline of my book. In a minute or two, I'm going to go into a deep dive on questions of satire, but I think we can move to the next slide. The press asked me to answer the question, why is this book important now, other than that it just came out in March? There's two reasons that I mainly came up with. The first is Lucretius's poem ends with a gripping, unsettling account of the famous plague of 5th century Athens, about 430 BCE, so a little under 400 years before the time of Lucretius himself. And why does this poem, which begins with a celebration of life and the generative powers of the love goddess Venus, why does it end with a historical vignette of disease, distress, and death? There are two answers to this question, which is the big question of this poem. This is something that scholars have struggled with for decades and are still haven't come to consensus on. I don't think we ever will. But there are two big answers. One is, in a way, ending with an enormous human calamity, full of distress, full of these graphic depictions of decay, and both individual and social decay, is a great test to see, have you learned how to take that Epicurean vantage point, looking down with detachment on the suffering of others. And not because of Schadenfreude or something like that, but because you can see, look, I'm separate from this, and so that shows the kinds of pains and anxieties I'm separate from, so I can appreciate the good life that I'm living. So it's kind of like a final exam, basically. Did you learn your lesson from this poem? That's one answer. The other answer comes, as you might expect coming from a guy like me, comes from satire. The end of the poem, even though it's unsettling, even though it shows kind of humans at their worst, can be viewed as kind of a dark comedy satire that shows that specifically satirizing the breakdown of social and civic institutions in the face of crisis. If that hits a button or resonates, that's sort of one of the reasons why I think this book might be important now. The other touches on what'll be the sort of second half of my talk. The age we live in is one of fake news and alternative facts and truths that are more outrageous than the satiric excesses of bygone years. And I could have said that sentence 4 years ago, but it seems like it's getting truer and truer every week and every day now, that the true things in real life are more outrageous than the satire of previous years. My book offers readers a set of tools not to separate truth from fiction, or satiric from serious, or good from bad. I'm not giving you any useful tools, but rather a thing that can help you orient yourself to a brave but not so new world in which we can't be as sure about what we know as we think we can be, or as we would like to be. So at this point, I think I'm gonna turn it over to Sean for some Q&A and then a poll on what your thinking is on one of these issues.
Sure, we do have one Q&A question so far, and that is touching on something you had mentioned earlier in the talk. Do we know whether Lucretius and Cicero met each other? Was there a literary circle in late Republican Rome?
So there's one scholar who argues that there was, in fact, a major literary circle under Julius Caesar's main rival, Pompey the Great, that included both Lucretius and Catullus. But that is kind of like an out there argument that most people don't side with. There's a tiny thread that connects Lucretius and Cicero, other than the fact that they're writing in the same time. They're part of the Roman elite, which is a relatively small group. People who are literate are a small group. Poets are an even smaller group. So they probably bumped elbows once or twice just by that, is my supposition. But the thread that connects them is in one of Cicero's letters to one of his friends. He talks about the Lucreti poemata, the poetic writings of Lucretius. And so he says that his friend has sent it to him and that he's read it, and that they contain a lot of art and a lot of ars, which means skill or craft or art, and a lot of ingenium, which means innate born talent. That's a thing that I don't think really exists in real life. But anyway, Cicero says that there's a lot of those two in this. This means that he and his friend have been exchanging poetic writings by someone named Lucretius. but there's basically no way of confirming if this is the Lucretius that I'm working on, or if, for that matter, it's the poem that I'm working on. This is the only poem that survives from the Lucretius that I work on. There might have been other poems. Some scholars think that he started writing satire and then later wrote this poem and like plugged some of his satires into this work as a larger work. Maybe this Lucretius that Cicero is talking about is an entirely different poet who just had the same name. There's more than one Lucretius at this time and across Roman history, so who knows. But some scholars think this is sufficient evidence to say not only did Cicero know Lucretius, but he in fact was in charge of editing Lucretius's poems after Lucretius's untimely death. Again, I think that's a step too far, but that was kind of the party line for a long time in the 20th century.
Excellent. We've got a few other questions as well. Lucretius explicitly remarks on the sweetness of seeing evils you yourself lack. How does the text mark a cue to read this comment as satire?
Yeah, so that moment is the opening of book 2, where he says, it's sweet to look out on the ocean from the shore and see a ship having trouble at sea. And then he says, not because you're taking pleasure in their pain, but because it shows you the kinds of ills you're free from. And I'm not the first person to think that this poem, this opening bit, which goes on to take this in a metaphor and apply it to politics and seeking wealth and merchantry more broadly. I'm not the first person to see this as a satiric proem. It connects to a major surviving fragment of Lucilius's satire that is a satire of people hustling and bustling in the forum, and there's a lot of verbal echoes there that make it clear that's going on. It models that high ground, low ground division that I was talking about, and in the mode of satire. And also, this satiric proem is a major source for allusion in the subsequent satirists, Horace, Persius, and Juvenal. Horace refers to it in his opening satire when he talks about turbulent waters and sailors thinking that lawyers and farmers have it better than they do. Persius has a bit in his 6th satire about a friend has been shipwrecked. Are you going to give them money? Well, if you do, then your heirs are going to treat you like crap after you're dead because you use some of their patrimony to help out your friend. And then Juvenal's 12th satire is, I've argued in this book and also in an article in the Cambridge Classical Journal, that Juvenal's 12th satire basically takes this moment in Lucretius, this 30-line opening of this second book of his poem, and turns it into an entire poem-long exploration of, well, what is the right response if you're not the person on the shore, but you're the person at sea? And so I think the fact that the later satirists draw on this so heavily, and not in a way where they're mocking it, but a way they're using it for their own satiric investigations, I think that is more evidence that this is marked out as satiric.
Okay. And another question from the Q&A. Given your analysis, how do you think Lucretius would approach and discuss today's situations?
Well, there's a lot to that question. So I mean, I'll talk more about the Epicurean response than the Lucretian response, because I think that one's easier to get at. I try to avoid getting too much into the intentions of authors, especially dead ones. But Epicureanism, you can come at it from 2 different ways: the sort of harsh reading of Epicureanism and the generous reading. The harsh one is basically that it's an egotistical, self-absorbed philosophy where as long as you are free from anxiety, then you're living the good life and you need not worry about anything else. And so for that, you could come to some conclusion that, okay, as long as you don't have COVID, as long as police aren't brutalizing you, then just live your life on yourself, stay out of public life, stay out of all these things that can get you in trouble, stay off the internet, and you'll live a good, happy life. And I think that's the one that has been sort of the standard view for centuries when people are thinking about Epicureanism, when they're thinking about it as anything other than dangerously atheistic, which is what it was in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. But the more generous reading, and my colleague at Wake Forest, Emily Austin, is currently writing a book on how to live now like an Epicurean for Oxford University Press. So she'll be she could weigh in a lot more detail with sort of receipts to prove her points. But the generous interpretation is freedom from anxiety isn't just an individual thing. That for us to be free from anxiety, really we need everyone to be free from anxiety. And so Epicureanism teaches us that it's not just you live as like a hermit sealed off from the world, but you have friends not just as people who can help you out, not just instrumentally, but also because you can get pleasure from having the friendship, from doing good things for them. And so this level of connection would tell us that for us to truly live a life free from anxiety, we have to live in a society that is safe and just. And so to that extent, I think that an Epicurean responding to the current moment would say, you can't have true ataraxia, you can't live a good life free from anxiety until everyone can, which means that it's incumbent upon you to take on the stresses and anxieties of protesting for social justice and against racism and police brutality in order to make ataraxia a possibility for everyone. And one of the chief bits of evidence for this from the ancient world is Epicurus, though he was not an abolitionist. No ancient Greek or Roman ever seems to have been an abolitionist, even though they consistently knew the horrors of slavery and their complicity in it. Epicurus did welcome enslaved persons and women who were both people who were traditionally disenfranchised from the political, social, and intellectual life of ancient Athens. Epicurus did invite them into the garden of his philosophy. He had a literal garden on the edge of town, and he had a kind of a commune kind of setup going on there. And he invited people in to learn and do philosophy with him.
Great. We do have a few more questions. Did you want to continue with Q&A or move on to the next section of your presentation?
Maybe let's do one more question and then we'll move on, and then there'll be more time for questions at the end.
Excellent, good deal. So we have someone says, thank you for your talk. I'm wondering about ancient reception of Lucretius in, for example, his fellow Roman philosophical luminary, the younger Seneca, who quotes him a few times, and if quotations and references to Lucretius in antiquity can reinforce or complicate your reading of DRN as satire.
Yeah, so I think on the reinforced side, definitely the way the later satirists read Lucretius, I think it gives us a guide to reading him satirically. Ovid does this too, as well as Horace, Persius, and Juvenal. Seneca, his philosophy, I'm not an expert at all in Seneca. Seneca's philosophy at times is playful and satiric in some ways, and some of the engagement there could be doing that. But it's also worth saying that, readers can recover multiple meanings and points from texts, even ones that the author didn't intend. And so it's totally possible to engage with Lucretius as a purely philosophical, non-satiric text. And some proof for that is just centuries of scholarship on Lucretius that from the modern world that do exactly that. And philosophers who build on it, including luminaries like Karl Marx, who wrote his dissertation on the atomistic philosophy that Epicurus and Lucretius are adapting. But on the other hand, I would say that it's also possible to do a bad job of reading, or to not fully recover or get satire. And stuff that deals with Epicureanism in the ancient world is particularly prone to being misread, either unintentionally or intentionally. There's a long tradition of one of the main rivals to Epicurus's philosophy was Stoic philosophy, which is more popular these days because of a lot of reasons, including that it fits well with Roman senses of self and with British senses of self and with modern toxic masculinity and with certain versions of Christianity. But the Stoic authors who early on were responding to and critiquing Epicurus's philosophy, they intentionally misunderstood a lot of his claims. And one of the ones that I have an argument that's forthcoming in a volume on Roman Epicureanism, edited by Sergio Yona and Gregson Davis, is that when the Epicureans talk about how big the sun is, they say, or specifically Lucretius, he says, it's as big as it appears. And that's a pretty close translation of a surviving bit of Epicurus that says the sun is as big as it appears. Well, the Stoics early on said that means that the Epicureans think that the sun is about as big as a foot, or a human unit. Nowadays we'd say a soccer ball or something. And that's a willful misunderstanding of Epicurean theories of vision and perception and perspective taking. And so I think there's some of that too, that there's intentional and unintentional misreadings of texts that can also complicate both what I'm trying to do and also counter arguments to what I'm trying to do.
Excellent, thanks so much. I will turn the presentation back over to you, and we'll have hopefully some more time for Q&A at the end.
All right, so I think go ahead 2 slides and we've got a brief poll. Oh, here we go, yeah. So the poll is, does satire do more harm than good?
Leave this open for a bit. Nobody's completely anti-satire so far. All right. That's not bad. So we've got about 71% of folks who responded saying no, of course not. And then about a third of you are thinking maybe.
Okay, well, the reason I asked this is because the rest of my talk today is going to be about what I term in chapter 1 of my book, the momentous risks of satire. So on this slide, I have 9 of them laid out, and they range from sort of mild risks to major risks, and from obvious to not so obvious. So I'll just go in order. And when I talk about these, I'm engaging both with not only my own thinking of thinking about satire and theoretical constructs of satire by other scholars, but I'm also building on reader response theory, and especially on experimental studies, so psychological and sociological studies about how satire works. So the first risk of satire is getting it. It might not be gotten. The audience might not get it. Studies show that somewhere between 13 to 26% of readers get satire when they're reading it. That is less than 1 out of 4 in most studies. That should be concerning. Number 2, satire might backfire and increase support for its targets. So the satirist is satirizing something. If someone doesn't get it, or someone gets it but doesn't like it, they might end up supporting the thing that the satirist is making fun of or is criticizing. 3, taking it too seriously. Satire can sometimes be taken, especially if you don't get it, it can be taken as serious. One of the things you can do sometime is Google literally unbelievable for an old blog that collected people on Facebook posting stories from The Onion that they thought were real stories and saying literally unbelievable. The best one of those was a congressperson who took The Onion literally when they had a news story on Planned Parenthood setting up a giant abortion plex. And another one, The Onion had a story called Congress Takes School Children Hostage in 2011, making fun of all the metaphors of hostage taking around budget negotiations. And they had a Photoshop thing of Mitch McConnell holding an AK-47 with a school child in front of him. Enough people freaked out about that the Capitol went on lockdown and the Capitol Police had to do an investigation into it. Number 4, the audience might misidentify the target. They might think that something is being satirized that wasn't being satirized, or at least wasn't meant to be, by the author. And this is again, you can recover multiple valid points from a text, even stuff not intended. It's really hard to talk about intention with any author, but especially dead ones. But then still there's this issue of misidentification. Number 5, the audience or authorities might have a hostile reaction, and that could harm the satirist or the satirist's allies socially or financially, or in authoritarian regimes, physically. Number 6, the audience might not see the satirist's absurd exaggerations as absurd. The way satire works is by doing exaggerated versions of things, parodying, that kind of thing, taking things to their absurd extreme to make fun of them and to show the problems with them. But what if you do that and you think you're being extreme or absurd, and your audience is like, yeah, you're just talking about a thing. And this is a thing this is something that's been documented in studies, experimental studies, that sometimes people don't view what's being portrayed as absurd, and that's a real scary thing. That connects to number 7. The satirist does these exaggerations and shows extreme versions of what they're satirizing. But these exaggerations might end up backfiring by making the less extreme version of the target seem acceptable to the audience. So if I'm making fun of, I don't know, litter bugs or something, and I do a really extreme version of people throwing trash out of their car in like buckets or something, then one of the possible effects could be not that everyone's more aware about littering, but that people now think if someone just throws a wrapper or a cigarette out their window, then it's perfectly okay. It's not really that bad. Number 8 is, I think, the most fun one. Partisanship and ideology affect perception of satire. In the 70s, there was a study that found that supporters of Richard Nixon, who was running for re-election in 72, they enjoyed anti-Nixon satire less. They enjoyed satire of George McGovern, his general election opponent. They enjoyed satire of McGovern more. There was a study in the 70s and a study in the 2010s that showed that for All in the Family, that Archie Bunker sitcom, and Stephen Colbert's Colbert Report, where he's making fun of Fox News Bill O'Reilly types, that your partisan position, your ideology affects how you perceive the show. If you're a conservative, you think Archie Bunker is the hero, and you think that Stephen Colbert isn't making fun of Bill O'Reilly, but is tricking stupid liberals into thinking he's making fun of them. Whereas if you're liberal, you think that Archie Bunker is the anti-hero, that he's the butt of the jokes, and that the point is that he's a racist, homophobic, sexist jerk. And if you're liberal, you think Stephen Colbert is satirizing and parodying Bill O'Reilly and Fox News types. So that might not be so surprising nowadays, given the kind of polarization that we have that affects everything. But that is one of the risks, that your thing will be that you will be divided based on partisanship or ideology. And studies show that people are more likely to identify satire and appreciate satire if they think the person writing it is trying to get them to adopt views that they already hold. So we're more likely to find satire where we already think we agree with the person writing it. But the greatest risk, and the most complicated one, is satire challenges epistemic certainty. What I mean by this, satire calls into question what is serious, what is trustworthy, and what we think we know. The audience, once it encounters satire, basically has to ask if the absurd and the extreme that they see elsewhere in the world are real or fake, authentic, or satire. In doing this, satire both requires critical thinking and undermines critical thinking. We need critical thinking to get satire, but once we get satire, we risk seeing satire where it doesn't really exist. And so the mere existence of satire threatens society's foundations for sincerity, meaning, and knowledge. And when I was writing my book, I specifically when I was writing this chapter, I was just scrolling through my Twitter feed, which I don't do much anymore these days, but I was scrolling through my Twitter feed, and a scholar who works in another field at another university, but who I'd met at a conference and I follow, she posted things saying, my assumption is that all things are always satire. And then I was preparing a version of this talk a few years ago, and I got an email from Obama's nonprofit Organizing for America, from them saying that an email that it was a fundraising email, but it started out, when you read a thing and you're not sure if it's true or satire, that's the feeling we're getting a lot these days. And so I think these are little bits of evidence that that satire has this kind of creeping effect where we just can't be sure anymore. So that brings me to a close. Before we move to our final Q&A, I think we have one more reflection and poll for you with a question. So which do you agree with most out of these options?
Here we are. Everything is satire, nothing is satire. We can never know whether something is satire or not. With proper skills and effort, we can separate truth from satire and take fake news from fiction, or shrug emoji. All right. Wow. Okay, we've got most folks responding. I'll leave it open for another couple seconds. All right.
Okay.
So hopefully we can separate truth from satire is half of what you think. And then if I don't know if it's a good result or a poor result that three of us think that everything is satire.
So it seems like about 20% of the crowd shifted from satire, being confident that satire doesn't do more harm than good, to one of the other answers. So shifted in response to some of the challenges and risks that I brought forward. All right. Well, thank you so much for attending and listening, and I'm excited now to spend the rest of the time on questions and answers.
Sure. One question that came in was, have you encountered the objection that the default way to interpret is the literal way, and therefore that way does not need proof, whereas your non-literal interpretation requires proof? In other words, that you bear the burden of proof.
So I think that whenever it comes to literary criticism and interpretation, like the stuff I'm doing, I do bear the burden of proof. Scholars trying to make claims about texts bear the burden of proof, and you don't want to make an argument from silence. That said, Roman poetry, and I'm not making an exceptionalist claim here, because there are lots of different genres and authors and texts and cultures and periods that engage with this. But Roman poetry, especially of the late Republic and the early Empire, during the time of Lucretius, during the time of Horace and Ovid and Cicero, Roman poetry is almost always doing something much more complicated. And so I would say that someone who thinks that the text is just simple, they have a burden of proof to explain why the text is unlike all of its peers, why it's unlike Virgil's Georgics, why it's unlike Catullus's poetry, why it is simple and straightforward, especially because it's not a treatise, it's not a handbook, it's not a primer, it's a poem, and it's a long and difficult poem. Just ask my undergraduates and my alums of my Lucretius course, one of whom I've noticed it was in on this meeting. Lucretius is hard to read, and so you have to sort of answer, not just why is it straightforward, but also why use poetry for something that even in Lucretius's time could be done in prose and had already been done in prose. There's evidence for, during and before Lucretius's time, people writing about Epicureanism in prose and gaining popularity for doing so.
Okay. And another question, is there a way to understand didactic satire, such as Lucretius's or any other later authors, as a way to have it both ways, to kid on the square, so to speak?
Yes, and in chapter 5 of my book, I talk about something I call didactic tension in satire. So satirists, the idea behind satire isn't just I'm making fun of stuff just to break things or something. The idea behind a lot of satire, whether it's explicit or implicit, and whether it's serious or not, sincere or not, whether it's being played around with, but the basic convention is they're trying to make the world a better place. They're finding blameworthy people or flawed ideas or problems in society, and they're making fun of them and thus calling attention to them, and maybe or maybe not proposing a solution, but the idea behind it is creating a better world. But in satirists, often satirists, in order to keep their jobs, basically, they need their playmates to stick around, and even though they're trying to push us there. So there's that tension, and this tension also plays into didactic because satirists are often taking the pose as a teacher. Sometimes this is literal. Horace, early on in his satires, uses the image of teachers using cookies to get their students to learn their ABCs, and he uses didactic poses like this elsewhere, where he's posing as a teacher to try to communicate his message. But they sort of play around with these tensions of they need to fix things, but also they're not really fully committed to fix things, and you can't really trust their sincerity. So that's all going on in satire. In didactic, it depends on the poem. Some scholars see see satire in a lot of different poems. I'm focused on Lucretius, but others have found it in the Greek poet Hesiod that I mentioned earlier, in Virgil, a different kind of satire. Leah Cronenberg has found that. In Lucretius, I argue that this isn't so much a tension as kind of like a synergy, where the satire reinforces the ethical and moral and natural philosophical arguments that the speaker is making. Sometimes that it can seem to undercut. Sometimes it's not a fair playing field. The speaker is giving us a straw man argument instead of a level representation of what the opposing side views. But in general, I think that those two work sort of hand in hand in Lucretius's poem. Oh, I think we might have lost Sean.
Yep, luckily I'm here as oh goodness. Yep, luckily I'm able to step in to wrap this up. We've still got a lot of questions. So, and you can hear me, right, T.H.M?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, our next question is, are there many occasions when it is difficult to tell whether the text is satire or not?
Well, my peer reviewers think so, I guess is the glib answer I could give. Yeah, I mean, satire thrives on ambiguity, and that ambiguity in turn can make it difficult to prove for certain that there is satire. And so some of the passages that I point to in my book could arguably said, no, this is not satire. And even some of the places where there's direct connections to previous satire or to later satire, you could make the case, well, Lucretius is using this earlier satire for a non-satiric point, or these later satirists are using a non-satiric text to make a satiric point. So there is that kind of difficulty and ambiguity that I play with. But again, scholars of Roman poetry have to be comfortable with ambiguity and inconsistency, because that's one of the hallmarks of the poetry of the late Republic and the early Empire.
Mm-hmm. All right, we've got another one. How do you see the role of Jonathan Swift in emergence of prose satire as a serious genre?
I don't have a good answer to this, because this is sort of pretty far outside my area of expertise. I acknowledge that satire exists, across cultures and across periods, and I bring in things here and there from other times, but I'm really mostly focused on the Roman period with some glances at Greek antecedents. So sorry that I can't talk about Swift's role here specifically, but there is a good overview of satire by Griffin. I can't remember his first name, from the 90s. That is sort of like a broader overview of satire from early Greece into the modern period, and covering Swift and others quite well.
All right, I've got two more questions, which I think maybe we can squeeze in if we can here. So the next one I have is, how important is the quality of the poetry in this work in comparison with the ideas that are expressed within?
This is a good one. There's a long been debate over in the scholarship on Lucretius over a divide between philosophy and poetry, and in recent decades, scholars have moved towards saying this divide doesn't make sense. So my answer would say that these two things are inextricably interwoven. That there's this great poetic style and value in art, and this kind of philosophical and satiric meaning going on inside it. And I think they're totally tied together. That part of what makes the poetry so amazing is the content, and the content, if you didn't have this poetic body for it, would be much worse for the wearer, I would say, and also much transformed.
Okay, and that does, we do want to leave a couple of minutes just to wrap up here. So to Ian David Belding, dealing with your last question, unfortunately gonna miss it, but we'll maybe talk to T.H.M about maybe getting you an answer post webinar.
Yeah, you and I can email about it.
Yeah. So yeah, to wrap it up, Sean, since you could you move to our next slide?
Yes.
Yeah, so thank you everybody for joining us today. We got pretty good turnout. We're really happy with all of your participation from all of you. So for the book, and let me just quickly drop into the chat here some links from this slide and the upcoming ones. So if you could go to the next page, the next slide, please, Sean. So we have a couple of ways that you can get the book following this talk. Sorry, I'm still trying to drop the links into the chat for you all. There we go. So first option that you have is you can go to our press at umich.edu website. We have a special discount code for all of you today to get 30% off the book, LAUGH VA. We also encourage you to support your local bookshops for T.H.M, that would be bookmarks, and then for any who are based here around the University of Michigan, Bookbound would be the seller we recommend. And then finally, we do have a free exploration of the ebook available on Fulcrum. As part of this talk series, you are able to read this freely on that site through August 31st. And the links to that are included, and a recording of this talk will be made available. You can check our Twitter feed and our University of Michigan Press YouTube channel, our website, to access that. So again, that brings us to 12, and thank you everybody for joining us today. We had a great time with all of you, and definitely if you want to reach out to any of us regarding for T.H.M, more about his book, for Sean and myself, anything related to the book sales and anything else, we are more than happy to help you. Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks.
Thank you.